Welcome to the Moulding Health Show. Our goal is to leverage the wisdom and experience of healthcare practitioners to set you on a path of self-discovery and healing. These insights, coupled with a multidisciplinary approach to each area of interest, should provide an invaluable resource to everyone looking for a better approach to health. In this episode of the show, we speak to Laila Jeebodh-Desai about depression and suicide from an educational psychologist perspective. Laila Jeebodh-Desai, welcome to the show. We're really glad to have you on board. Thanks for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Oliver. I really appreciate you actually hosting me here as well. It's a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, so the pleasure is always ours. We always say that. And I'm always curious in terms of how Shaz manages to get, because she's completely in charge of the schedule, how Shaz manages to get some of these connections like yourself on. So Shaz, tell us, how did you meet Laila?
To be very honest, I met Laila. Basically, I sent a LinkedIn connect request a while back. And when we were looking for this, the guests for kind of this quarter, I sent mails out and Laila came back, and her and I went a bit back and forth over scheduling and topics. And eventually we settled on the topic and a date, and here we are.
Yeah, thanks for doing that. And it just shows you the power of social media. Hey, it's an interesting world. And Laila, in terms of LinkedIn, are you quite active on that platform?
I am quite active on that platform. I find it quite a lovely platform to connect with like-minded professionals,
Okay.
And also to share very interesting information and up-to-date information, also knowledge about the field of mental health as well. So I do find it quite an interesting site and quite a useful social media platform.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think part of this is also us understanding how healthcare practitioners are also evolving, in terms of that. And I think there's a huge need. And I think just before we started, you were telling us about, the value of mental health, wellness and, creating that awareness. Because today we're going to be speaking about depression and suicide. Not quite the uplifting topic, but definitely, something that's so prevalent and so important. I think especially over the last few years with the COVID-19 pandemic, it'll be interesting to get your thoughts on all of that and how people are making sense of it. But yeah, thanks for doing that. Also, thanks for almost embracing the technology part, and putting the word out there in LinkedIn and stuff like that.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Oliver.
So to kick it off, tell us why this topic of depression and suicide. I know we're lumping them together, and maybe you'll shed some light in terms of whether we should or shouldn't. But yeah, maybe just kick it off there.
Well, I was quite intrigued by this area of interest, especially with regards to mental health. And the intrigue increased during COVID-19 and during the pandemic, during lockdown. And what was so interesting was to see it rapidly getting noticed, and that noticeability that occurred amongst everyone. Mental health workers, we're talking about healthcare practitioners, we're talking about teachers, teenagers, parents. And mental health became so recognizable, specifically depression and anxiety. So this area became so interesting, and a very interesting area to watch and witness and observe. Watch that impact and watch the noticeability increase amongst people. People who weren't aware that there was something such as depression, or perhaps just interpreted it as sadness, or something that you just merely get over, and realizing that depression is not just something you get over. It's like a fracture. When someone fractures their leg, you don't tell them to shake it off and carry on walking. It's the same thing with depression. It's not like sadness. It's not like just being sad for a day. This is an extensive symptom that actually extends beyond 2 weeks and continues. And just like a fractured leg, you cannot shake something like that off. It needs attention. It needs diagnosis, and it needs treatment that is suitable for the person who is actually going through all these symptoms.
I like that. And so how would you know, though, if someone is is under depression or is depressed right now. Because I think I like what you said. It's not just someone being sad, because I always use the personality types, of like Winnie the Pooh. EO is always sad, but is he depressed? I'm not sure. Is it the same kind of thing? How do you know that someone is depressed?
Interesting that you did go to Winnie the Pooh. And I have to say, Winnie the Pooh is actually quite a fascinating animation. I'm not going to even say cartoon. I feel like it's too insulting. But anyway, it's such a fascinating animation that completely personifies mental health. And like you said, Eeyore, there's not a moment that you notice that Eeyore is elated. And that itself indicates, when you're talking about the symptoms of depression, it extends over at least 2 weeks. And according to the DSM, which is our diagnostic system and manual of mental health disorders, it must extend 2 weeks and more than that. And then you have different severities of it. You've got mild to moderate to severe depression. And there are various symptoms, such as like changes in energy, and loss of energy or fatigue, loss of interest or pleasure in activities that once were enjoyable, trouble sleeping or sleeping too much, feeling sad or having a depressed mood. So we're not just talking about the feeling of sadness when you lose something or you have an argument. We're talking about a mood that just extends past the actual event and continues to exist. And there's somewhat an increased purposelessness, the sense of purposelessness or inactivity or inability to sit still, pacing. And people often mistaken it as someone just lying down all the time or just, not being communicative. And it's not always that. It's someone who's obviously irritable, consistently irritable, being unable to sit down for longer extended periods of time, or perhaps speech that becomes quite negative in connotation or quite aggressive in connotation, changes in appetite, feelings of worthlessness, difficulty concentrating or thinking or making decisions. And then above all else, there's these persistent thoughts of death or suicide.
So, Laila, I love the way that you mentioned the Winnie the Pooh animation, because it does go beyond a cartoon, and you are right, it is very much a personification of mental health. I mean, if you really break it down, Eeyore is the personification of depression, whereas Piglet is the personification of anxiety, and Tigger's definitely ADHD. Rabbit, I'm not so sure about yet, but Christopher Robin is maybe a little bit schizophrenic, but that's the amazing thing with it. But more importantly is that there are layers or levels of depression. So somebody can be, like you said, having a mild depressive episode that with a little bit of help are able to get through. But then you mentioned that really severe depression. Now that, I'm assuming, is then that almost that long lasting, just it goes beyond 2 weeks, 2 months. It's that constant just feeling not worthy, worthless self, Would that kind of depression be something that would be linked to maybe suicidal thoughts or tendencies?
So while it can be linked, all severity. So we're not saying depression is the leading cause of suicide. It's often one of the symptoms, or we can say basically people with depression don't always commit suicide. And that's something that's very important to remember. Just having a diagnosis of depression doesn't mean you are suicidal. It is perhaps part of a decision to commit suicide, a part of a contributing factor of suicide. But at the same time, when we're looking at the severity of it, and when we're coming to quite severe depressive disorder, perhaps these are also individuals that have not had a clinical diagnosis for a very long time. And when diagnosed, obviously need the medication, obviously need the extra care and the therapeutic interventions, medication, and other lifestyle changes in order to help them cope. So the severity of the depression does not impact on suicidal ideation itself, because depression should not be synonymous with suicide. There are many, many people with the diagnosis of depression that are not suicidal. Yet suicide is one of the, could I say, I wouldn't say leading causes. It's not a leading cause. Suicide is actually a decision that is made, whether you have depression or not.
That's interesting. You know, when we speak about suicide, I can't help but think of like my early school days, and whenever there weren't too many, but whenever there was a suicide in the school, I mean, it was the biggest thing ever. And what you said, it makes a lot of sense, because almost like it doesn't get picked up early enough, and maybe because you don't know that, and especially with kids and teenagers, maybe hormones and all of those things. But do you find that this comes up a lot in the school setting? Because I know for us, I mean, as a school, I mean, it was like a huge shock. Everyone is in mourning for like a week, maybe even more. Do you find in a school setting that it happens a lot?
Funny enough, I would say, looking backwards, mental health was never part of conversation. It was something that you do not speak about. It's a sort of a cultural absolute not, or seen as a weakness, or seen as something that is quite odd, or even joked about. Fortunately enough, we are now at an era where people are now conversing, and the conversation is there so often amongst teenagers. They are now talking about mental health. They understand, and teenagers, and I'm not saying all teenagers, but the conversation is now very much active and alive with teenagers about mental health, about, something as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And you see those abbreviations thrown wildly, my ADHD is kicking in or something like that. And teenagers now are talking about anxiety, and they are talking about depression, which is wonderful. There's now conversation that is no longer taboo. And the sad part of it is, it had to cost the lives of so many other teenagers in order to get this conversation started. Teenagers are not talking about it. We're watching various series on Netflix, and all these series coming out that are based on suicide. And we hear a lot of people saying, oh, don't watch it. You will plant a seed. Talking about suicide does not cause a contagion. It's not contagious. Talking about it makes it less taboo. The more you talk about it, the more teenagers know what to look out for. And no, it doesn't plant a seed for them, but it makes them almost activists in understanding what mental health is and doing something about it. So in my private practice and private capabilities, I'm getting a lot of referrals, funny enough, from teenagers who email me, worried about other teenagers who are noticing symptoms. And my friend spoke about this, and I read somewhere that you wrote about this. And what do I do? What do I notice? And the whole idea is you talk about it, you reach out that hand. So what I'm noticing amongst adolescents right now is that they are talking a lot more than we are. There's so much more we can learn from them about this ability to create less of a taboo and more fluidity in our conversations about mental health disorders, specifically depression.
I actually really resonate with what you said there about teenagers are having conversations that we would never have dreamed of having as a kid. It just wasn't spoken about. So like what Oliver was saying, when somebody in your school committed suicide, there was this grieving period over the loss of this person, but nobody actually picked up those warning signs, whereas teenagers these days seem to be a lot more in tune with what is happening. And you're right, it's the adults that aren't always as in tune. We don't always seem to pick up when a friend or a family member is actually not necessarily depressed. As you said, yes, sometimes depression, suicide can come from depression, but not always. So what would be some of the other signs that you would look out for in a person to maybe just reach out to see, listen, do you need a hand? Are you okay? Is there anything I could do or say to try and help? I can see you battling.
So, it varies. And the people who are closest to the person are the first ones to observe and notice. The one thing I could only say is check in on each other as human beings. And the moment that you notice a change, like I mentioned before, the irritability or the sort of reclusiveness, where someone becomes less communicative with you, and suddenly becomes very silent and reclusive and does not want to interact. And then you notice there's an instinct that you have that this person's actually not okay, or something is a bit odd here. And then you do get the verbalization of it about, oh, life is just too much. Or this is getting a bit much. Why do I do this? I don't see I don't know what my purpose is. I don't see the point of anything. And you hear these dropping in conversations. We have to stop that, that tendency of, oh, you think that's bad, this comparative speech. You think that's bad. My life is even worse. We need to stop ourselves and really listen. That when someone actually says or talks about being in pain or discomfort or having a very hard week or hard day, we need to be human beings first and care and say what happened. And if someone says it's not worth it, or sometimes I just feel like ending it. We have to take that very, very, very seriously. And to say, really, why do you say that? Are you getting any help? And there is a common practice of, oh, no, I'm not crazy. It's got nothing to do about you being crazy, but it's got about you being unwell. And it's the same thing. And we look at something like a pandemic. The minute you have a cough or a sneeze, everyone's running the other way and putting on a mask or something like that. We need to take this whole idea of depression and suicide that seriously, that when someone talks about it, you listen and you watch the signs and you watch this feeling of inadequacy or talking about failure. And there's obviously noticeable signs if you are close to the person. And it's obviously sometimes related to situational stress. So something like bereavement or someone that has lost someone very close to them. And we're seeing more of that because of the pandemic and the amount of death that had incurred. Ending a relationship amongst teenagers, even adults, divorce. We're talking about isolation and loneliness when that happened during the pandemic. We need to be very wary of people who are not coping. So the only thing I could say is to, when you ask someone, how are they, to genuinely wait for the response. If you're going to ask how I am, I'm going to genuinely give you a response. And even if my response is very small, look out for those cues and care enough to say, why do you feel that way? Can I help? And if you don't know what to do, can I come with you? Can we get help together?
Mm. And I think, Laila, what you said makes a lot of sense, because I think we live in a world where everything is it's busy all the time. And I think even sometimes I joked with someone recently because, like even exercise, it's supposed to be 20 minutes, right? A day, but you can't even carve out sometimes that 20 minutes. And it's kind of ludicrous when you think, actually it's only 20 minutes. But it's the same kind of thing. When you ask someone, it's almost this cursory, that's what I should be saying, rather than what you just said now. You're almost like listening. And if it's not exactly what you thought it was going to be, then you go deeper. But yeah, I like that. What I was also thinking as well is that, from a time point of view, I think with people, it's almost like, if you look at COVID-19, I mean, it was such a difficult time that, people, I don't know if people have been like desensitized to it, or they actually understand how difficult it was or stuff like that. But I use always the example of our kids, how they almost like just seem to have gone through it, just like even wearing a mask, it's like they don't ask a question, they just wear it. But have you had any thoughts around that in terms of how people actually get almost like sensitized to the new environment, in terms of actually making sense of it? Or has that, do you find people just kind of accepted what went on in the last few years?
It's quite an interesting question. And as much as the cover seems as though we have accepted it, our behaviors are indicating otherwise. It has quite a big impact. Being in isolation, and although we made it part of our lives, has actually affected us. We're seeing that in teenagers who have not had the ability to and I'm talking about teenagers who are psychosocially in the age of identity versus, role playing here, and or role confusion. And especially when the age of adolescence is purely about finding your identity, and you are now in an environment that is completely isolated from the rest of society, where you're unable to be in a social atmosphere of testing what my identity is, role confusion comes about very quickly. And not knowing that and being in isolation and making part of your life, and then suddenly you're becoming out of isolation, you're going back to school, going back into society, and then feeling the sense of anxiety now prevail, feeling the sense of depression now prevail, where I don't fit in, and there are cliques, and there are people who came from different schools, and I don't fit in. And we're noticing this is increasing and increasing, and the agitation and the depression, where I just can't get over it, and I just want to be isolated. I want to be by myself. And this is all an impact of what we think we've made an everyday thing. We've made it we're so desensitized to it that we actually don't notice what has happened. We have changed completely in 2 years. And we notice that with adults as well. And that is, the big awkward question of coming back to work. And, where there's no longer a work from home, and adults are now told to come back into the office environment. And yes, things must go on as they were. Absolutely not. We have changed fundamentally the way of living in 2 years just by being in isolation. So while it seems on the front that we are desensitized to it and we made it in everyday life, we are actually changed psychologically. And it's only now that we're noticing this change.
Mm. And does the change bring about more feelings of depression or more chances of people being depressed? And the reason I ask that question is, I worked in corporate for many years, and I think sometimes as simple as changing a chair or changing someone's desk would result in decreased productivity. And it was the weirdest thing, because some people just kind of rolled with it. But most people actually were very, this is my chair, this is my desk, this is where I sit, there's the window. So do you think that, by the changes that we were almost like forced to deal with over the last 2 years, that almost causes people's mental health to decrease?
So what I do feel is that it's a trigger. It's more of a catalyst. So events, substance abuse, trauma, or a traumatic event are often triggers and catalysts to mental health disorders. So it doesn't mean that you were never, ever prone to depression or anxiety before that. It could have well be inherited. It could have been passed down. You always had this pre-existing diagnosis, or this diagnosis that just occurred throughout your family, but a triggering event. And being in isolation, being in the confinements of home was very triggering for a lot of people who didn't notice that this actually existed, or perhaps knew, and something as an event such as a pandemic, which is a triggering event, would have actually highlighted these symptoms that were actually quite dormant, and brought to life with a triggering event of being in isolation, being completely cut off from, the noise and distraction of work, and being surrounded by people all the time that you're actually not connecting with yourself. And now being in isolation and being left to just connect with the self and realizing I'm actually not okay is a triggering event. And as much as we look at it as a negative, it's also an invitation. It's an invitation now to dig deeper and turn within, and now start looking at yourself, start helping yourself. Before jumping into society, before wanting to help the world, we need to start with ourselves. We need to check if we are actually okay on our own before getting out there again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. I was actually trying to search for that series. I watched it many years ago. I think someone recommended it to me, but on Netflix, it was called 13 Reasons Why. Was that one of the shows that you were talking about earlier? Sorry, it was stuck in my head. But
100%.
okay, cool. Yeah, it was actually quite addictive. I couldn't stop watching it, to find out. But yeah, I can kind of see, even in that series, where the little, the teenager commit suicide. I mean, if you look at the impact on their community and their school, what far-reaching impact that had was quite interesting. And I think that's the thing with suicide. I know probably we're moving from one to the other, but the thing with suicide as well is it almost like leaves that I want to say undisclosed, or that open-ending story, that you never know sometimes what the reason was, which is actually quite difficult as well. So, I mean, I think, with that, I'm saying that, depression is quite difficult. I think suicide is quite difficult. And I think the combination of the two must be quite horrendous for anyone around that person. Yeah. And coming back to what I was trying to say earlier as well is, what you said about these changes with people and also with the greetings, is that sometimes, knowing the people around us, we should know when changes are happening. I know, like with adolescents, obviously changes are happening, but people around us, even from a working environment, and I think sometimes we're not so in tune with that, but normally you can see the changes happening. Do you find that as well?
I do find that, depending on your level of closeness to that person, whether they are related to you, whether there's someone that you know socially. I mean, there are a lot of people that are not close to their family members, that they are much more close to their work colleagues or extended family, as they said, which can be just friends. And there's always someone that actually notices. And it's noticing when that person has changed, or not contacting, or not joining in meetings, or there's something that they say that almost triggers a response from you going, okay, something's not okay. So I think right there, it's noticeable. And it may begin as something very, very small, and that you just want to brush over. Oh, they're fine. But it's often a decision that is made, and slowly messages that are given. And the really scary and the sad part is they usually do give signs away, and they start to give some of their things away, or start apologizing and looking for forgiveness or something like that. But it's also important that those kind of decisions that they make are little triggers, as well as little signs of calls out for help. They're calling out for help right there and then. And it's such little triggers that you can see and you can misinterpret as well at the same time. The idea and the law is never doubt it. So where you are thinking this person is suicidal, don't think they aren't. That is the golden rule. Don't second guess and say, I'm overreacting. It is better to overreact. It is better to blatantly ask someone than not ask and regret it. So the idea is, no question is taboo when it comes to suicide. You talk about it, and you talk openly about it. And you ask a person straight out, are you thinking of ending your life? You're sounding quite upset. What is going on? Like I said, you never plant a seed, but you're also inviting the person to actually talk to you, respond to you, and get the necessary help that they need.
I can imagine those are quite difficult conversations to have, but as you said, very necessary. And I think sometimes it's being brave enough, to have that conversation. I think some of us are probably not equipped, to do that. But I think, if you know the person enough, and I think if you care enough about them, then you almost like push past that boundary of, your own discomfort, and probably just have the conversation. And I think the worst case scenario is they say actually no, or yes, like, can you help with this, or can we find help together? Because even coming back to the suicide thing, that's the most unnatural response from a human point of view. I think even if you're trying, I mean, like, obviously you watch these movies, but when you're trying to like drown a person, I mean, they're always like, they're always fighting for survival. And I think as humans, and even that, the suicide moment, I can't imagine how someone would actually get to that state without us talking about mental, health, and how unwell the person was, to be able to consider that. So yeah, interesting around that. Do you find that more people, or certain groups, are more prone to suicide? Do you find like a certain demographic, male, female? Again, this is subjective and it's more just your experience. But do you have anything around that?
So sadly enough, the stats together with my experience, males are actually more prone to suicide, both suicidal ideation and actual successful decisions to commit suicide. It is predominant amongst males in South Africa and globally as well. And we're finding that more and more. Socioeconomic factors play very, very important roles as well. And here we're seeing quite an interesting equal blend here. So the loss of jobs, the loss of job security has caused an immense rise in mental health challenges and mental health diagnosis amongst people who have lost their jobs. At the same time, when we're looking at suicide and the ideation of actually, what is your method of suicide, we're also noticing there are groups where buying something like ammunition or guns is actually much more available to higher socioeconomic statuses as well. So when I say socioeconomic status, it really, really is equal. It doesn't, suicide does not discriminate amongst the rich or the poor. It is much higher in males than it is in females. And what is so interesting here is our culture of, saying boys don't cry or suck it up, or from such a young age. And you sit with these grown-up men or grown-up males or grown-up born male, and we're hearing this discussion of what was actually seeded and what was actually the foundation of talking about my emotions, of feeling completely sad or inadequate and not being able to verbalize this amongst men is quite shocking. While when you're looking at females, we're able to verbalize, and I'm talking about born females, and able to verbalize, you're not criticized, you're not looked down upon for crying or exhibiting emotions. And I think that has a lot to tell about our stats. Look at the amount of males that are feeling, I cannot actually talk to someone. I can't actually reach out to someone because I may be interpreted as being weak, or I may be interpreted as being inadequate or not man enough or not man enough or whatever it is. But this is quite disturbing. And alarmingly as well, equally sad is members of the LGBTQIA community as well, also very at risk for this because of not receiving specific support in coming out and being able to being supported within families as well, within family systems, not being able to speak, be supported, or feel complete isolation, and not knowing that they are communities that they can actually join and communicate with and be supported in that respect. So sadly enough, we are noticing the trend in more males around the world, and specific also in South Africa, are definitely more prone to suicidal risk and behavior and ideation. And members of the LGBTQIA community also were very high in that regard, and that statistics as well.
Laila, I'm actually, what you're saying about the suicidal tendencies and ideations in men does make a lot of sense, because there seems to be this pressure that is put on from a young age of, you're one day going to be the man of the house, so you're going to take over the business, you're going to be the head of the family, you have to be strong, you've got the broad shoulders, you've got to. And I think that often plays a very big role in that feeling of, well, I can't talk to anybody and I can't show emotion and I can't show weakness because I have to be the strong head of the family, head of the household. And then you add corporate life to that, where it's, let's be fair, it's shark-infested waters, where, it's a dog-eat-dog world and everybody's out to get everybody else. The last thing you want to do in a corporate environment is say, hey, guys, sorry, I'm struggling. So men tend to internalize a lot more. So I really do get that. And then, yeah, from the LGBTQIA, the alphabet army, I do understand. It is a very lonely experience until you find a community. And oftentimes in that, you're losing family and you're losing friends. And that, I would also say, would definitely play a role in possibly having suicidal ideations, or even if it's not suicidal ideations, just pushing you into that depressive state of I'm not worthy. So I think communities and families need to start. Firstly, we need to stop with the toxic masculinity. You know what? If a little boy wants to cry, he can cry. I mean, we shouldn't be saying, oh, suck it up, it's okay, boys don't cry and all of that. We need to get rid of that archaic way of looking at things. And the other thing is, I'm not a parent, but I see how, my parents, friends of my parents, and so on, just kind of reacted to the situations of somebody coming out. And, again, I think it's more often than not, parents react out of fear rather than actually educating themselves and understanding what might be happening with their child, because you can't tell me that a parent doesn't notice that there could be these things. But because you're not talking to that child, and especially when they're starting to go into their adolescence and are, like you said, trying to find that identity, the moment that identity gets rejected by, that could also cause depressive feelings. It could cause suicidal ideations. And this is stuff that we need to make normal. We need to stop making all these things taboo. We need to stop making, men feel like they have to carry everything when that's why you get married. It's a partnership. There's two people in it. You work together, you build each other up. But we don't seem to teach that to little boys. We seem to teach them that you are, and I think that's what causes a lot of it. And it's just so sad to see people going down this route because they've been taught you can't talk to anybody.
100%. And it's so sad, Shaz, to see this societal norm, or we've almost made it a norm, like you're saying, for males to take care of, and you are responsible for this, and you should do this, and you should do that. And when you really think about it, there's an equal pressure on females to find a partner. And if you don't, then you're inadequate. What is going on? And it starts off as little, when you look at fairy tales, we're not scrutinizing any, because I still love them and I still love watching them as well. But there's always got to be someone that has to be rescued. It has to be, a male that comes and rescues. And now you're seeing all these wonderful animations coming out that are actually now challenging the system. Using a different role play here, where now females are now becoming, their own protagonists and their own heroes. And, I totally love that. And we're also watching, like we said, movies as well, testing these theories, testing the waters of now putting females at leads, and females saving the day, or rewriting history to see what exactly happened to all the queens and the princesses during the times of unrest. And we're watching something as like The Crown as well. Let's not go any further than that. I mean, the queen is female, and yet look at the amount of pressure she had put on her. And it's just fascinating to see, as a society, we're actually contradicting ourselves. We're actually saying we want to be progressive and we want to be modern and we need to do this, but we need to change the narrative. We need to change this narrative that has been brought down to us and not challenge the narrative. As much as it's wonderful to be rescued, it's also wonderful to start rescuing yourself, noticing your abilities, to be that hero for someone else, if not yourself. And that changes the narrative, especially for males and females and LGBTQIA community, of how do I help another? How can I help myself? And starting to employ that invitation to adventure as my own hero.
I'm really glad you brought up movies, because it was a question that I wanted to ask and I wasn't sure if I should put it into the brief or so on. So let's talk about Encanto. Okay. This is a movie that came out recently. I don't know if you've seen it, but the big controversy at the moment is Disney went out and they made millions of the Mirabelle figure. But the one sister, Louisa, is the older sister. She carries all the pressure. And it actually, her song from Encanto has blown past Let It Go from Frozen. And it's called, The Pressure. And it's about that pressure of being the eldest sibling and, she just can't crack and all of this. But how many young girls and young boys want Louisa dolls as opposed to Mirabella dolls is speaking to exactly what you've just said now. In a lot of ways, we're changing the narrative, and we're changing it by trying to get the younger generation to get out of the narrative that our grandparents and parents and parents have sent down to us. So I think movies are starting to open the conversation a little bit more. So yeah, it has been quite interesting. But from a psychology point of view, I read, it was an article by somebody in the USA Today, and he was saying just how many barriers Encanto broke when it came to looking at mental health and looking at family dynamics, that it really just brought it all out into the forefront. So yeah, movies are definitely making a difference.
That's wonderful too. I'll be honest, I have not watched it as yet. It's on my watch list of movies to get through once I can, but I'm fascinated by this now. You've just intrigued my fascination, Shaz.
Yeah, Shaz is quite the movie buff. I haven't watched that. I didn't even hear about that, to be completely honest. But I did want to say Disney has made like a conscious decision over the last few years, because you talked about princesses and queens wanting to be rescued, and I think they made a conscious decision, especially on the racism front as well, to say, actually, let's just change the narrative. And I thought that was quite admirable, in terms of that's how you get the consciousness, the awareness going. I think also, in the times that we're living in, even the Dr. Seuss books, came under scrutiny because, some of the books weren't quite like, completely, like they had connotations of like racism. And I think that's kind of the beauty of the world that we're living in. People are a lot more aware. And, coming back to the LG, as Shaz said, the alphabet stuff, like it's also, you can find the communities, that you need to, whether that's on Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever that is. And I think that's the beauty. So like, I think anyone listening to this as well, because we do want to keep it actionable. So anyone listening to this, and if depression is kind of like, oh, maybe something is going on there, or suicide, I think help is around. You just need to figure out how to ask for it. And if you need someone to guide you through that, I think there's people that can do that. But I think, Laila, I mean, like your space, and what you're doing even right now, by talking to us, is showing that people should be aware and can be aware. And, help is just a few, sometimes maybe a few text messages away. So yeah, glad to see that. Something else on the movies, I don't know if you guys ever watched Pretty Woman, but with Julia Roberts and Richard Gere.
Perfect.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. But I remember in the last part of the movie, like when Richard Gere, comes back to her and he says, so after the prince rescues you, what happens? And she says, well, I just rescue him right back. And I thought that was quite a nice attitude, for anyone that's feeling like a victim, is because you can change that narrative. You can't, it's not about you being saved all the time. So, which is quite cool. When we spoke about depression and symptoms, is crying part of it? I don't know. I'm not sure if I picked that up, but I've heard that people that are depressed, they cry almost like continuously, or cry at like a drop of a hat or something like that. Do you find that? And then the other thing that I noticed, and I don't know if this is true or not, but they almost like stop like taking showers or baths or something like that. Is there something to that as well?
I would say that, crying, who doesn't do it? And let's be quite honest, if you're watching someone excessively cry, it's our human responsibility to actually find out why. So I would say no, crying and depression are not synonymous all the time. People could cry for various reasons. And when we're talking about something like bereavement in itself, one of the symptoms you will experience when you're experiencing grief is bereavement or severe sadness, which entails crying. But that does not mean you have a diagnosis of depression. It means you are actually quite sad. And you are mourning, and you are, in such a bereaved state of emotion and intense emotion that you're crying. People also cry when they are severely stuck or feel in some way absolutely distressed. But once again, this is not synonymous with the diagnosis of depression. Crying can be seen as an experience of sadness or elation, depending on what you are crying for. It also can be a sign of severe anxiety as well. It doesn't mean people with anxiety don't cry. Of course they do as well. When the pressures of life become extreme or, become just unbearable, where there's a sense of doom and gloom, which is also very synonymous with the symptoms of anxiety. So crying is not just completely deducive to depression. It's not just a symptom of depression. Crying is a human expression of emotion. So someone who's constantly crying, who's in constant distress, needs that attention to be actually spoken to, but we should not just go out there and place a diagnosis or a label on them as, oh, she's depressed or he's depressed or they are depressed at all. Find out what they are crying for. What is the sense of loss or mourning? Is there concern? Is there worry? Is there something going on? It's not just subjective to and only conducive to depression.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think as you said that, I was like, yeah, if someone is crying a lot, I mean, that's obviously something you should look at straight away. You mentioned grief quite a lot, and I think it was probably intentional. But recently, Shaz and I mean, we had someone on the show, and she spoke about disenfranchised grief, and I thought even that was like amazing. Where almost like you don't have the ability, or someone stops you from grieving. And I thought that was actually quite interesting as well, like it's something new that we learned. But it's like all of that stuff that you're talking about, grief and everything associated with grief that could cause people to not feel, completely right now, and, could lead down this path. Is there anything around depression or suicide that we probably should have asked you and we didn't? I mean, is there anything that kind of springs to mind?
Quite interesting is the cultural component of it that we need to actually talk about quite openly. And there's this often cultural component of this or this exclusive thing about talking about suicide, or, it becoming such a taboo thing to speak about amongst cultural diversities as well. And we need to be very clear here. I would say suicide itself is so diverse in its way. It embraces diversity. It thrives on diversity. It doesn't ignore any race or any culture for that matter of fact. So to think that, or to have this understand that my culture doesn't do this, this is, not a practice my culture does or whatever, something happened to this person, or, there may be a belief that there was some spiritual thing going on, which is, you're completely entitled to believe that, but we need to get to the basic of it. Let's rule out actual medical facts first before we get there. Let's try and actually make a difference to people's lives. Take away all these cultural components to it and look at a human being as a human being. Suicide does not ignore anyone, and any culture is susceptible to it. But we need to start, I think, our cultural leaders. We need to get to our cultural leaders to start facilitating these talks about suicide, facilitating these talks about mental health challenges, specifically depression, as well as anxiety and suicide. And we're seeing this movement going on. We are seeing cultural leaders reaching out to us to say, okay, this is happening in my community. And we're noticing that this has happened, or this sudden loss of life happened in the community, and now everybody is quite shocked about it, don't want to talk about it, we're not allowed to talk about it or whatever. But it starts right there with our cultural leaders. We need to get cultural leaders. We need to start the conversations with them. They are such a wonderful instrument of actually creating these conversations that can create hope, that can create areas of people to actually reach out. Like you said, help is not even a phone call away anymore. It's a click away. You know, you could get on sites or walk away. You could get your nearest temple, churches or wherever your areas are and ask for help. But we need to reach out to our cultural leaders to be open to this, to be flexible, and to be absolutely available to have these conversations.
It's a nice aspect. I don't think I would have considered that. Whenever I think of it, it's like more like guidance counselors. But you're right. I mean, that's such a huge avenue. I think South Africa is quite a religious country still, and I think so what you're saying has a lot of importance, because yes, you can definitely target it towards there or direct it towards there. But do you find that, I mean, when I not lump, but when I associate suicide, I always, obviously associated with death. Do you think as a society we talk about death as much? Because those are very similar things. Because I almost think that we bypass that. Even with children, like we try not to talk about that because that's very dark and morbid and stuff like that. Do you think as a society we do enough of that as well?
That's such an existential question. And, and I'm going to be very existential here when I say this. And, the whole idea of death or your own mortality creates anxiety. And an existentialist, that should actually make you live more. And that's quite an interesting take that existentialists take, where just the understanding of your own mortality should allow you to live more. But now you obviously need to speak and have conversations about mortality in order for people to understand, I need to live a fulfilling life. There is a movement, and there's this movement with a lot of, you're hearing this word purpose, where people are trying to find their purpose now, where purpose is not just a job and not just creating this fantastic lifestyle. It's about, am I truly happy in what I'm doing right now? Am I living my purpose, or am I living a purpose that has been put upon me? And we often ask this question, in therapy, is what would happen if this was your last day on earth? And someone said you had maybe, or let's just say the last day, 30 days to live. What would you do? And a lot of people, when you ask this question to a lot of people, it's like, oh, I would go out there and buy this, and I would tell people that I love them, I would do this, I would do that. And just to see this anxiety that's created just by understanding your own mortality, we take it for granted that we are given 30 days. We don't know that. If anything, a pandemic like this has made us more aware of mortality itself. And it's allowed a lot of people to rethink purpose, to rethink where they're going, their direction in life as well, which is something we should be doing constantly. And at the same time, with regards to suicide as well, this is where it comes into effect, to understand that each one of us, has a finite day of days to live. And to make a decision to actually discount yourself of those finite days is something that is not normal. And, to just look at that existentially is that, yes, everyone has a finite way of living, but if you are given purpose, if you find that true purpose in your life, what would you do? What would your life look like? And right there, once again, change the narrative. What would you do if you knew today was your last day, or in 30 days was your last day? And if you knew that, then why are you not doing that right now? Why aren't you making those decisions to truly live, or to truly question your purpose and not feel like you're stuck in it? You were never stuck. And the idea is you can change your life in a matter of decisions, in just a decision. And we're saying change here, not terminate, not end. We're saying change. Change is the only constant. Scientifically, we know that change is the only thing you can depend on. But terminate and extend and end something like that, we can't test the theory. No, you're not in a better place. And we need to start that conversations. No, no one's in a better place. No, their pain is not gone away. They are gone away. We need to be real with that conversation. That doesn't end your pain. It extends it to other people who are actually quite close to you. It extends it like a disease, like an illness, and the sadness continues. But to understand that change is the only constant, and to actually start that narrative with someone to say, well, we are actually mortal beings and we have a finite day of living. and the only constant is change, how would you change your way of living or your life right now in order to feel more purposeful?
I love that. I mean, you said that term actually worked for a company. It was called DYDX. You know, in maths, it's the change, you know, derivative thing. And yeah, I mean, that was the slogan, but this was all the way in the 90s. I love that. And if anyone doesn't know what, you know, I mean, obviously you work quite nicely with your clients and they're quite blessed to have people, you know, like resources like yourself around. But that, what you just said now, I think if you take anything away from this episode, it's probably that, you know, like change is the only constant. And what you said is what I believe in, is I think you have the power to change it. I think, you know, if you, and the interesting thing is when people are forced to do it, you know, like you said, you got 30 days to live, you know, you got a cancer diagnosis or whatever it is, people make those changes, you know, they, and I think also in the last few years, you know, the whole thing with working, you know, people are starting to get to that realization. Actually, maybe this is not the right job for me. Maybe I can work different ways. Maybe I can work in a hybrid setting, all of those kind of things. So I love how you said that. I love, you know, what you said, because I think, yeah, it, like I resonate with it. Because people always talk about money and circumstances and life and stuff like that. You know, they always use these excuses, but I think if they really had to be honest about it, I mean, you're kind of the most important person for you. And to make that change, you know, shouldn't be too difficult, you know, whatever that is. And I think if they do that, probably, you know, the mental health improves and all of that stuff. But thanks for saying it. I really like that. Shaz, that should definitely be one of our keepers. We try to take excerpts from, you know, the episodes, and, you know, like everyone has like these amazing things that we would have never thought, you know, how they said it. And for me, Laila, that was it. Shaz, anything on your side before we wrap it up and ask Laila for last final thoughts?
Just on my side, I think, yes, change is the only constant. Laila, you also said there that, you know, when somebody does commit suicide, it doesn't take the pain away. It just spreads that pain around. But I think one of the other big misconceptions people have about suicide is that it is a selfish act. I think if somebody has reached the point where they are prepared to discount that finite number of days that they have out there, we should actually be able to look at and ask ourselves, you know, where did we fail this person, as opposed to that, yeah, but they were so selfish. Look at the damage and devastation they've left behind. Do you feel the same there, or do you agree with the narrative that committing suicide is a selfish act?
I think the loss of life itself is tragic. Loss of life. That's it. For anybody losing their lives, whether it is your choice to do so, or whether it is a natural, you know, tendency, or, you know, the cycle of life, whether it's through illness, loss of life itself is a tragedy. And we need to look at death as almost a disease. So someone choosing to make such a decision like that is a grievous, sad, and completely tragic decision. This decision is tragic. There's no judgmental terminology or label that we should place on it. We're not talking about selfish, because we wouldn't really know. But what we know is that that decision is extremely sad. The repercussions is irreversible. There is nothing that anybody can do once someone makes that decision. It's irreversible. And I can understand when people are saying it's selfish, because it's usually the people who are suffering thereafter. And the suffering becomes so, it becomes so uninterpreted. It becomes so like Oliver said in the beginning, so many questions unanswered, and you can understand that. And you can understand those who get very angry to say, don't say that they were selfish, because these are people who are quite close to them. But then there's an overriding feeling of guilt that we have to be very careful of, and saying, what could we have done? You know, yes, there's a question, but you should never bear that question as there's something I could have done. I know there's something I could have done. And that's called survivor's guilt. And that's also very scary to put on someone. So in order to sort of confront this, we need to be aware of the judgmental fact. And that's such a mindful thing to do, is be aware I'm judging, be aware that I'm thinking that this person is selfish. I'm thinking, what could I've done? And then surrender. Surrender. Be aware that you're thinking selfish and surrender, because a tragedy has occurred. Whether whatever you think has happened, a loss of life occurred. And a loss of life before an actual time that it has occurred is even more tragic. But we have to be very careful of that, of not creating blame or judgment on the person who committed suicide or the survivors that they left in their path, family members, close friends. Be very kind and be compassionate to these people, the people who have taken their lives and the people who they have left behind. We need to show more compassion, less judgment as a society. And there, in that compassion lies the healing. And there in that compassion lies the conversations that we need to have. It's compassion. And the compassion versus tragedy, you have a head-on-head right there. We have a way that we could actually challenge it and, address tragedy with compassion.
Mm-hmm. I think Shaz used a last question to be quite, it was a good question right at the end. And I think, Laila, you answered it perfectly in terms of, well, when I say that, I mean in terms of helping us understand it a lot better. But I love that, because I think it speaks to, because that's a common term, selfishness and all of that stuff. But I like how you said, use tragedy and compassion in that context, because that's exactly what it is. And Laila, on your side, any last thoughts before we close it up?
I think for me, compassion, and as a mindfulness practitioner, compassion plays such a big role in being human with each other. And surrendering things like judgment, specifically on ourselves, being aware when we are judging ourselves, being kinder towards the self. Before we can say, let's extend kindness and let's perform random acts of kindness, we need to question ourselves very often. And how kind are you to yourself today? How were you kind to yourself today? What did you do that was kind enough? And right there, the kindness and just loving kindness for oneself, and then having this very beautiful concept of extending that love, that unconditional positive regard for self, and then extending it to unconditional positive regard for another, makes us more compassionate beings. To just be compassionate in itself, like I said, is such an antidote to tragedy. We need more compassion in this world. And in order to be more compassionate, you need to be more kinder. And in order to be more kinder, you need to turn within. So we all need to be a lot more mindful and a lot more present and aware of where we are ourselves.
I think you just stepped up the gears in the last bit of the episode, but I love that. Because, you always speak about these kindness jars and the gratitude journal. I wonder how many people actually put kindness things, that they've done for themselves in those jars, or gratitude entries, that are related to themselves. So really loved having you on board in terms of the episode. The topic was amazing. And we'll include all of your details in the show notes, but thanks very much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the time and also the devotion that you've put into the show as well.
It's been an absolute pleasure having you on board, Laila. Thank you.
Thanks for finding me, Shaz.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening. As always, stay tuned and we'll speak to you in the next episode.